Curiosity-led exploration has fundamentally changed the progress of human society as we know. The urge for exploration is a universal and a distinctive trait of human beings. And that's actually a big motivation of the course, Human Journey to Mars, which was offered as a 2-semester graduate design course starting in fall 2016 as well as in spring 2017. It is often asked, why do we explore? And one of the greatest answers to this question is actually by George Mallory, who said it is because it's there when he was asked why he wanted to climb Mount Everest. Of course, we're not sure, probably he did climb Mount Everest and his body was recovered back in the 90s. And those magical words have actually resonated very well to justify why, the why questions. Those questions are often are the ones which border lunacy, right? The fact that we went to the moon back in the 60s and very reasonably unjustified or very ambitious. So often, in the modern world where we talk about modern world, we call it like pushing the boundaries, right? So this was almost kind of lunacy back then. So once we unravel the teleological thread of discussions, we are left with the simple fact that Mallory leaves us with. Prehistoric men and women may have stood curiously, at the edge of a mountain and have always wondered what's behind it, and that's probably an essence which is captured by all the exploration program NASA leads, along with the industry. So I am Professor Rak Sahia. I am here to unveil what we call the pioneering Martian base study results, and I'll explain what the course is about, how it was born. The students and myself, we have put our lives behind this study in the last 6 months with sleep deprivation, which was completely voluntary in nature. So I'll talk about that. So one of the magical images from the exploration is President Kennedy's speech back in 1962, right? He gave a lot of speeches in the Congress as well as at Rice University. We are so used to, working on different architectures to explore Moon, Mars. But we tend to forget, why do we explore, right? What drives us? So that's something I would like to spend a few minutes talking about, why we explore and what are the reasons we do so. And being a visiting assistant professor, I often do get the question, how am I visiting Purdue when I graduated from Purdue itself? And actually, I learned that President Kennedy was a visiting professor at Rice University when he gave the speech. Although I'm not as powerful as he is or he was, but I can still say that yes, we choose to go to the moon, or instead of that, we say we choose to go do this study, Human Journey to Mars, and do other things, not because they're easy, but because they're hard. So I found some similarity with President Kennedy. And then why Human Journey to Mars? Why I did it? It's a very simple reason. It's to share the joy of human space exploration, right? We want to see our species, escape the cradle. We've been here modern humans being here for the last 200,000 years. And then also give students the avenues and the experience working in such a large-scale end-to-end human Mars architecture work, which in very likelihood they would not get 10 to 20 years into the careers if they work in the industry as well as at one of the NASA centers. So that was the motivation behind. So what did we achieve? So we do have a study report that's under review. We have submitted 6 conference papers, out of which 2 have been accepted at the International Astronautical Congress. If you are planning to go there, I will see you there. And then, of course, we have a few papers pending acceptance at the AAA space in Orlando in the summer if you want to enjoy the Florida heat. So I could not have done this course, of course, with this the valiant group of students, I would say. We fought, we argued. I'm pretty sure my evaluation might drop because I did push the students to the limits. The evaluations are coming up. And of course, this is a wonderful picture we took in the class when Dr. Buzz Aldrin, who is here today, visited us in the class, and he shared his wisdom from his exploits in space. So I would like to also acknowledge the help I have received along with the students. I could not have done this course, and I repeat, I could not have done this course if there were people who did not believe what I believed in. So one of the person actually is George Takashi. Is sitting there on my right, and he actually led the virtual reality experience. If you have already been to the Envision Center earlier today, you might have experienced that. So thank you, George, so much. And as well as his entire team of Ivan and many other students. And then I also would like to say that this was a multidisciplinary course, and we wanted to have students from all fields possible, because human Mars exploration is not only for people in astronautical engineering, but also people from all walks of life. When I say walks of life, it's from all branches of engineering, arts, and the sciences. And we did achieve, to some extent, we have students from all these different schools and colleges, from aeronautics and astronautics. We have students from mechanical engineering. We have students from electrical engineering, industrial engineering, biomedical engineering, civil engineering, construction engineering and management, earth, atmospheric and planetary sciences, health and human sciences. So this was a big achievement on my part. We did this. We did invite people from political science, but for some reasons they were not able to participate, because we did wanted to investigate what are the possible governance model we can use for human Mars exploration should we colonize the planet. So I would not have been here speaking to all of you if without a person who has played a tremendous role in my life. I would not have been doing human Mars exploration. Dr. Buzz Aldrin, whom I have known over for the last 4 years very closely, and he's a person sitting at the front. I've spent a lot of days, a lot of nights working and talking about human Mars exploration. So thank you, Dr. Aldrin. Could not have done without you. Another person who has played a remarkable role in my life is my former advisor and now a colleague at my school, Professor James Languski. He's a professor of Aero and Astro. Thank you so much, and I'm very happy to tell you this course was born out of AE 450 Senior Spacecraft Design. I worked with him for the last, starting 2012 on different 450 projects, and I thought we should pursue a graduate version of that. So thank you so much. We have Professor Tom Shee, is the rock. He supported me throughout, and he has provided the funding to host the event, so thank you so much. And he's at AFRL right now. I believe he's driving back. He should be here at around 3 o'clock to meet another Purdue alum who retired today from AFRL. So thank you, Professor Shee. Of course, not the least, we have Mr. Bill Gerstenmaier, our beloved Purdue alum, and also the Associate Administrator for Human Operations and Exploration Mission Director at NASA headquarters. I interacted with him, exchanging emails at 3 in the morning, and we almost predicted his lifetime, when he will be awake, when he will respond, how much time he'll take to respond, and so on and so forth. Also got to know that his life starts really early at around 4, but that's where my daybreak happens as well. So I also would like to thank Mr. John Connolly from NASA Johnson Space Center, and he's a human Mars study lead across NASA, so he leads a team from all NASA centers. So thank you so much, John and Bill. Appreciate it. So there are more people. I would not move ahead without thanking all of the people, so please bear with me. So, of course, I want to thank our colleagues from all the NASA centers, particularly NASA Johnson, Michelle Rucker, Rob, and then NASA Langley. I have Bob Moses here, Michelle Monk, Alicia Ciancillo, And then Jeff Harreth for their support. From Marshall, we have Tara Polsgrove, who is visiting us. Thank you so much, Tara, for all the work. And students, as I said before in the day, students were dying to meet with you. And then NASA Ames, they could not come because they had a review today. I heard there are a number of reviews in the last plus minus 1 day. And then, so I would like to thank Athiraj Venkatapati, Dean Continos, for his support, for their support. NASA Goddard and Harley Thronson, Jamie Esper, and my colleague Kyle Hughes, Jacob Englander, need to be thanked as well for their support, as well as NASA Jet Propulsion Lab, and I'll definitely come to the Jet Propulsion Lab. So they have played a tremendous role, and I need to thank Dr. Robert Sishko, who is here sitting on my right, Mr. Hoppy Price. They helped us to build the cost assessment model, as well as some architecture assessment. So thank you, Bob and Hoppy. Hoppy couldn't be here today because of some earlier commitment. And Miss Emily Law is the Deputy Program Manager of Data Systems. So we did worked on visualization of Mars and Phobos data. And then Charles Wetzel, who's a Manager of Program Formulation Office, Mars Program Directorate, Exploration Directorate. So thank you so much, our colleagues at JPL. Purdue, I would like to thank Dean Michael Harris, Associate Dean of Engineering for Engagement, as well as Professor Carl Johnson, who is sitting right here, for all the support, help, and being with me, and also providing funding, partial funding for some of the activities in the course as well. Thank you so much, Carla. So I would also like to thank Professor Wayne Chen, Professor Bill Anderson, Professor Dan Dampacker, and Professor Dan Dillard. These were my colleagues who actually helped me to run the course. And when I say run the course is to even offer the course when it was first proposed. So thank you so much. Of course, could not have done without our AE staff. Particularly, in the short notice we had. So Rita Baines, Nicole, Anna Bors, Christine Malavenda, Leslie Lindman, and Jen Laguerre. So thank you so much providing the help. And then we have the Envision Center. So I've already thanked George and Laura Tiedemann, who have provided tremendous help in getting the virtual reality experience out. And that was, I made it a point, and George made it a point, it happens. And of course, we'd like to thank our distinguished visitors from Lockheed Martin. Rob Chambers is here, thank you very much. And Tony Antonelli, Team Chican, Brian, thank you so much for your support. Boeing, I believe Rob is here, I guess. Thank you. Aerojet Rocketdyne, Joe was here, but he had to leave because of an emergency. Thank you, Joe, for at least showing up. And then, and we do understand the Coalition for Deep Space Exploration. We have Dr. Marilyn Dittmar. Thank you, Lynn, for all the help. Blue Origin SpaceX, we don't have any representative, but we started late, so we did not get any representative, but we did try. So thank you very much. So that's where I wanted to give all the acknowledgement, right? All the recognition. I could not have done this course without you guys, so thank you very much. So before we go to human journey to Mars, so let us think, step back and look at the bigger picture of why we even explore. So we know the exploration is very innate, right? So it's an inner urge, so we know it has to be something to do with genes. So one, George Miller said it's there, but actually the driving forces are our genes. National Geographic actually wrote an interesting article called Restless Genes, and it really captured a lot of the traits and why we explore and what are the genetical reasons behind it. And actually they did find out what they called an adventure gene. It's called DRD47R. And it's closely related to the other variant DRD4, which actually controls dopamine. And why I'm talking about genes, it really matters, right? So it's actually genes that drives or it builds the urge for us to explore. But I think it'll be not quite correct to say one single gene affects. So gene is the urge, I would say, but we also have to have the means and the methods to explore. And the means and methods in today's world would be technologies, right? So we cannot just say we need to go to Mars. and just go. We have to build the technologies, all the support, the infrastructure behind it to sustain such a program. So this is, it really kind of connects very well with why we explore, why we want to go to Mars. And then I would go back. Actually, now I'll travel back to the history of human beings. Actually, 200,000 years ago, as we know, that's the fossil remains we have seen when the first modern human emerged somewhere in Ethiopia here, Omo. It's a place called Omo Kibish. And then people actually, what happened in Omo back in around 70, 80,000 years ago, that was probably the worst phase of the Ice Age. And so it was very cold, and the human population declined to a significantly low level of around 10,000. So it was extremely difficult for a species to hang around with 10,000 person or 10,000 numbers. Something happened. It's not very well known, and this valiant explorers actually set out by the time the climate warmed up. But these people, they left, the niceties of the tropics where you have game animals, to have a very steady life. And these people, migrated through this Bab el-Mandeb Strait and then reached Australia in 30,000 years. So this migration, crossing this strait, is probably one of the momentous, point in human history, right? So this showed that humans, take the risk of, leaving some niceties of life and then take the plunge. We also know there's another set of people who actually migrated from Taiwan, but these are the same set of people, right, who started back in Africa, and they, I missed it. So they actually reached the Polynesians, and I'll try to connect all this. Why am I even talking about all this? Right. So if we go to the next slide, we see this is what the Bab el-Mandeb Strait is. So it connects African mainland into Asia, and if you see, this is around 15 kilometers. And these early explorers, they might have actually stood on the shores of this and used to stare at this island or the piece of land over and over again. And when one day, probably we would call a mad person, will take the plunge, take a boat, and then leave, right? So this is what we call explorer, and it's exactly probably what happened 70,000 years ago, that the guy took the plunge. Now, if you can call John F. Kennedy mad in a romantic way, probably yes, it's to take the plunge. So this is, again, considered to be one of the critical points in human history. So what if we do not explore? What if we do not explore? We become complacent, play with cell phones, and then we stay at home. Probably we'll become Neanderthals, right? So we will become extinct. But we tend to laugh at Neanderthals. And we do forget most of the times Neanderthals actually have existed on this planet far longer than humans. They have existed. They lived for 500,000 years on this planet, and we are just 200,000 years old. So we have to work really hard to even surpass them. So we shouldn't laugh at them much. This is the area Neanderthal controlled, or they spread out, and Neanderthal took 500,000 years just to spread around this, and humans took only 50,000 years to spread around the globe. So that's what we can do, and we have done. So this is very interesting, and then from here I'll share a few anecdotes and really quickly about some of the interesting events in the history of mankind, our Polynesians. So these are the people actually who started from Taiwan and then moved. They developed key technologies, so it relates to, again, human Mars exploration, because you need to have the right set of technology to do everything. So these are the people who actually invented the outrigger boat, which is very stable in open oceans. So and that enabled them to actually move across open oceans and actually go to Polynesians and then colonize Polynesia, right? So again, it relates back to human Mars exploration, is to have the key technologies to do that. These are the peoples who actually invented superior navigation technologies, how to look at stars, how to look at the tides, how to look at the color of the ocean, how to look at the fishes around, and how to look at the birds, actually to figure out where they're heading. And then there's another example, I'll come back to Polynesia as another example of homesteading, right? So this is, I'm getting at the point of pioneering, right? So NASA keeps, addressing or trying to relate human Mars exploration, more in a pioneering sense, right? How human explorers went back. So these are good examples of, the sod houses back in the 1800s when we had the Homesteading Act started by President Lincoln. That people who settle westward to the Great Plains for at least 5 years get 160 acres. So this actually started the mass migration of around 80 million people back then. So this is another great example because when people arrived at this area, there was absolutely nothing for them to survive on. So these are the people who pioneered the area. They made it sustainable in the long term, and we know the rest is history. So these are great examples. And coming back to Polynesians, actually one of the interesting characters is Tupaia. Tupaia is a person alive today. Tupaia will tell us how many islands without reading any map, without having any sectant or any kind of GPS devices. He will tell us exactly where he is on this planet. And he can navigate around hundreds of islands in the Polynesians. And actually, British explorer James Cook took help of Tupaia and to navigate around the Polynesians when he was looking for Australia's incognita, right? So it's essentially, the southern continent. It's a very interesting story, and James Cook, for who he was with monumental ego, did not like Tupaia because Tupaia knew a lot. And this was the image he made out of using his memory, and all this knowledge have been passed through generations, just through folk songs. So we have people in Hawaii and other Polynesian islands. Actually, they still have the knowledge. And then we come to Antarctic, and 1898 onwards till 1922 is considered to be a heroic age of Antarctic exploration. And of course, we cannot talk about Antarctic exploration without taking the name of Robert Scott, Amundsen, and Shackleton. And is an iconic picture of Roald Amundsen. I believe it's a Robert Scott looking at the Amundsen, or probably it's Amundsen himself. So this is, when the South Pole was conquered back then. And then we have Shackleton, is an English man. He's considered to be one of the greatest explorers in human history, right? When he took out his ship Endurance and he wanted to cross Antarctic from coast to coast, when he lost out to Amundsen, reaching the South Pole. And he had a heroic journey where he saved 28 men when he got stranded on the Antarctic pack ice, and then he got back after a year or so more. And it shows a lot of his, the work he did to keep his men alive in Antarctica for several months. So now we have reached the modern age where we have the Amundsen Scott South Pole Station. So this is run by the U.S. National Science Foundation. Houses around 200 people during short summer, and then 50 people during harsh winter. And this is what the current South Pole Station looks like. There are poles. You can actually elevate the poles a higher level as the snow accumulates. And there is almost zero precipitation in the polar regions. So the snow builds up because of wind. Why I have ended up here, Amundsen Scott South Pole Station, this is exactly the model we are using for a human Mars study. We wanted to see what it takes to have a South Pole kind of station on Mars. And in many ways, it's a great analog. Antarctic South Pole Station is a great analog because it's extremely difficult to maintain. And according to a recent study, actually, to support one science staff, you need around 9 to support one science person. You need 9 support staff. So that's and it's also the analogy goes like that's 90% of the iceberg is below water and 10% is above water. So this is why I told the students in my class to build a South Pole station. So I asked to design a pioneering base on Mars that can support about 50 humans on Mars without incremental buildup of capabilities, similar to the winter over scenario of South Pole Station. And detailed construction strategies, civil engineering needs our operations of the plan for 25 to 30 years, and then advanced capability to reduce routine support and supplies from Earth. Okay, so it's a 2-semester design course. We completed everything in 2.5 months. So all the work we will present here was completed in 2.5 months, supported, of course, by the fall study we did last year. So I will end with this amazing advertisement which Shackleton put out. There are some theories that it is not right, but I think it's amazing. It's one of the most studied advertisements in the history of advertising and communication. And I'll live with this. Man wanted for hazardous journey, small wages, bitter cold, long months of complete darkness, constant dangers, safe return, doubtful honor and recognition in case of success. So I wonder what the advertisement for our Martian explorers would be. With that, I invite the principal architect of this class, Steve Jusek and Robert Potter, to present the results of the study. Thank you very much.
In the fall of 2016, we set out to explore what would be needed to reach the red planet. By January, we had expanded our focus to a 50-person permanent Mars base, reminiscent to that of the South Pole Station. My name is Steve Zuzak, and this is Rob Potter. Together, with a mix of 40 undergraduate students and graduate students, from multiple disciplines, we have approached this problem. Over the last year, we have learned much, expanded our knowledge, and begun a personal journey that for many of us will continue pressing toward the red planet for years to come. Like any great endeavor, we build from the knowledge of the past, utilize the technology of the present, and carefully plan for the goals of the future. We have a rich history of continuous human habitation in space with the International Space Station. Currently, private industry is working on building an economy for space travel built upon the infrastructure NASA and the ISS have set forth. As we speak, new heavy lift vehicles are being developed not only by NASA, but also by several private companies to expand this infrastructure to beyond low Earth orbit. We set out to find the next step, the step that will lead the way to Mars. In selecting a site from this Mars base, several factors are considered. Knowledge gained from robotic missions over the last several decades is leveraged about the potential resources, scientific value, safety for landing and launch, and terrain features. The map here highlights a few of the considered sites, and as you can see, they all lie in the northern mid-latitudes. This belt provides large deposits of subsurface water ice and offers a longer summer than its southern equivalent due to an eccentricity in the Mars orbit. Considering the various values of each site, the needs of our base, we chose Deuteronomus Mensae. Deuteronomus Mensae is at the dichotomy boundary with craters formed during the ancient past of Mars's history. The exploration zone has a 100-kilometer radius centered around the landing site. There are interesting surface features such as highlands, low-lying plains, and numerous periglacial features, all indicating extensive glacial activity in the past, the remnants of which exist as subsurface ice laden with cryotic sediments, giving us a glimpse into the distant past. Beyond these sediments, this site provides multiple scientific regions of interest, or ROIs, regions that may contain evidence for Martian life and habitability, as well as records of the environmental evolution of the planet. There are also substantial resource regions of interest. Rich with water, ice, and building materials, Deuteronomus Mensae has a substantial amount of easily accessible ice rather than hydrated minerals, which are common to other sites and are also more difficult to process for water. The exploration zone Deuteronomus Mensae lies at the edge of a Noachian-aged crater with walls rising almost 1.5 kilometers above the floor. The site contains amazing scientific opportunities, and including an area that may confirm that there was once a northern ocean that formed what is now called the Borealis Basin. The exploration zone is surrounded by valley networks and outflow channels that may have come from this ocean. Clues dating back to when Mars had a magnetic field could be hidden in volcanic rocks, preserving the magnetic signature of the planet. There is ample evidence of glaciation in the area. This province is evidence suited for the study of ancient atmospheric composition and possible biosignatures in the ice that's trapped beneath the surface. The zone is also close to special regions, identified by NASA as potentially harboring clues to extant or maybe even currently existing extraterrestrial life. The base will sit on a large deposit of subsurface water ice. The ice is thought to be between 1/2 and 10 meters beneath the surface. An estimated 6.5 cubic kilometers is waiting for extraction, analysis, and use. That's about 30% more than the amount of water in Lake Michigan.
So our study looked at a timeline that incorporated 2020 to 2100. We split that timeline into 4 different phases, starting with science precursor and humans in lunar vicinity. After 2030, we move on to initial human exploration of Mars. From 2050 to 2075, we build up our base until we reach that 50-person state, after which we have steady state operations. Several of the milestones you may be interested in are, we have our first interplanetary vehicle, which will eventually take humans to Mars, assembled in the mid-2020s. Around 2039, we have our first human landing on Mars. By 2050, we have a continuous human presence on Mars, similar to our continuous human presence in low Earth orbit right now with the ISS. By 2060, we have 30 people on Mars, building up to that 50 people by 2075. In 2080, we see our first human retirement on Mars. This timeline incorporates such a long period that we actually have people retiring and living out their rest of their lives on another planet. By 2090, we have 80% of our food being produced on Mars, making our base as sustainable as it could be.
We start our initial human habitation and exploration of Mars in the 2030s. We see the first human landing in 2039. Though this is not a permanent stay, it truly will be a momentous occasion for humanity. At this point, equipment is starting to arrive on the surface, but there is no permanent base yet built. The scene before you will be used to show the gradual buildup of capabilities over the decades. Now, you won't see any humans on this image, because to scale, they would only take up about 4 pixels. On the top left, you see the representative number of humans that are on the surface at the final year of a decade. Now, this is going to always show you the number of astronauts in that final year. The top right is home to the MAV, or MAV. The MAV will always be present to show our crew will always have a ride home. Capabilities are separated into 2 generations, and now the idea of multiple generations is something that's going to come up multiple times in our study. Since our study extends more than 80 years into the future, further development of capabilities is planned but is carefully balanced with additional cost and risk criteria, and only extends to the foreseeable. In other words, no warp drive. The first generation of the MAV is used until 2044. The second generation will be used from that point throughout the rest of the missions. The important difference between these two is the need to bring fuel. The Gen 1 version will have a launch mass of Earth of around 20 tons, while the Gen 2 cuts that back to closer to 10. The Gen 2 vehicle does not need to bring methane from Earth, and it also does not need to bring an integrated in situ resource utilization, or ISRU, unit to produce propellant. After 2044, the base will be producing the required propellant with no need for additional equipment from Earth. Back to our screen, the bottom left shows the power being generated at any given time. Though it's difficult to tell at this early stage, there will be a lightning bolt that will represent 100 kilowatts of power. Currently, the base is producing about 50 kilowatts, and it's using a mix of 2 of these 3 sources. The 3 sources of power for the Tyro base are Kilopower 10, a large fusion reactor based on the Scalable Amtech Integrated Reactor Space Power System, SARES, and this is a concept, and the Megaflex solar array. The Kilopower 10 uses a Stirling engine, produces about 10 kilowatts of electricity, has a power mass ratio of about 6.5 watts per kilogram, and it will be only used for a short time as the base is being built, with the final units arriving in the 2040s. SARES has the added benefit of not using any movable parts. Instead, it uses an alkali metals thermal to electric conversion. It produces about 111 kilowatts of electricity and has a power mass ratio of closer to 37 watts per kilogram. This unit will see its first mission in the 2050s and continue throughout. Though this reactor is currently only a concept, a similar unit is necessary to power the base. The Megaflex array has a long lifetime and has the extra added benefit of not using any toxic materials. However, on a planet where dust storms can rage for months at a time, it is unreliable as the sole source of energy, but it does provide a valuable complement to nuclear power. The bottom center, all the way to the right of the screen, shows the ISRU equipment and will eventually show what water is being produced in that decade. The last piece of equipment on the screen is perhaps the most important for building a permanent base: construction equipment. To build a city on Earth, heavy equipment is mandatory. Mars is no different. The Construction Mobility System, or CMS, is capable of carrying our habitats and equipment from landing site to launch site. Its modular design allows for either a flatbed for larger payloads or connection of one of multiple attachments, including a crane, blade, grading equipment to assist in the construction and preparation of a site. To set the foundation to build upon for generations to come, this equipment will quite literally pave the way. As we leave the 2030s, we start seeing the beginning of Tyro Base and the beginning of permanence on Mars. In 2043, we will set a permanent presence on the red planet. At the end of this decade, there will be a total of 6 people present on the surface. Power production has increased to 150 kilowatts, and water production has hit the ground running and now produces 350 metric tons of water in that first decade alone. All of the water required for the base for all uses will be produced by ISRU by the year 2045. Also, we see the first habitat structures start to take place and the first human-carrying rovers being put on the surface. The rovers include both the Multi-Mission Space Exploration Vehicle, or MMSEV, and the Surface Transport Vehicle, or STV. The MMSEV arrives first and carries a maximum of 4 people. Shortly thereafter, the STVs arrive and carry a max of 6. Both carry deployable solar panels to recharge during a max of a 14-day mission with 40 hours of operation between charges. Habitats are split into 3 generations. Currently, we have the Gen 1 HABs, and they're designed to be multi-purpose. There are 3 of these initially, and since they're all sent first, they serve all functions: medical, recreation, workshop, science, etc., etc. The design is based on the EMC monolithic habitat and provides about 150 meters cubed of habitable volume. Moving from the 2040s, we start seeing a substantial buildup of capabilities. The 2050s are an exciting time on the surface. With 18 people on the surface now, the power is bumped up to 350 kilowatts, and water production to 950 metric tons to meet an increasing demand for an ever larger base. The first SARES unit starts up, and the last kilopower unit shuts down. The first airlock node is installed, allowing for additional habitable volume, safer ingress and egress, and additional connection points for loading supplies. You can also see there are 2nd and 3rd generation habitats already in place on the surface. The Gen 2 HAB is based off of the EUS, or the hydrogen tank of the upper stage of the SLS rocket, while the Gen 3 is based off of an inflatable Bigelow concept called the Sundancer. Gen 2 HABs will typically be used for residential and medical, while the Gen 3 will typically be used for science and recreation. Both generations will come with built-in radiation shielding in the form of spot shielding, meaning protecting where it's necessary. The shielding will be made up of water coming from the ISR unit, and production will help to naturally pressurize a water system in the base. Staying in the HABs at all times, an astronaut could expect an annual dose of radiation of around 90 millisieverts per year. Now, this is compared to an unshielded Martian environment, which delivers approximately 250 millisieverts in a given year. At this point in the buildup, the habitats are distributed as 4 residential units, 4 residential units, a medical bay, and a recreation center. Another form of hab here you see are greenhouses, the first ever on Mars. By the end of the 2050s, let me go back to that. One second. By the end of the 2050s, the greenhouses will be producing around 20% of the necessary food. And this quickly scales up to the 80% where it will stabilize over the next decades. Greenhouses are based off of a Gen 3 habitat design and are organized into multiple racks that run the length of the structure. Hydroponics is used as a planting method because it's significantly more space efficient, but it does require more power. A water flow practice called the nutrient film technique produces a constant stream of water and nutrients that naturally flows down an inclined plane, holding the plants. This technique is especially valuable because it decreases the chances of bacterial growth, which is often an issue with any stagnant water. Our base is starting to take form as we round out the 2050s, but there's still a very long way to go. In the 2060s, we will end up with 30 people on the surface, 550 kilowatts of power, 1,430 metric tons of water produced. There are no new kinds of assets. Our capability now includes 5 habitat modules, 2 recreation centers, 2 science workshops, our first rover and repair workshop, and a total of 8 greenhouses. There are now 6 rovers in place, allowing for more people to explore the surface than ever before. We round out this relatively stable period by expanding our capabilities rather than adding to them or adding complexity. As we enter the next decade, we hit an important and very exciting milestone. The milestone we hit is the closure of our first base design. We call this the open hex design. Each hexagonal arrangement of habs is connected by a new piece of technology, a tunnel system. These retractable tunnels provide vital importance to the safety and construction of the base. Though not shown in the main snapshots, they will also connect the rovers to any airlock units, allowing for astronauts to change out of their EVA suits prior to entering the base, thus decreasing the risk of contamination. The tunnels connecting habs are an important aspect because, when retracted, they allow the construction equipment to enter the center of the hexagonal grouping. This will allow placement and repair of any hab at any time. The hex layout also decreases the total length of the base from one end to the other as compared to a linear setup, for example. So driving a rover from one side to the next will take less time and energy. Also, the loop design allows for easy accessibility and safe passage of the crew in the event of a catastrophic hab failure, while any non-closed loop would trap crew on one side or the other of the failed hab. Concluding the 2070s, we see the population start reaching 47 people. Power has now reached 900 kilowatts, and ISRU is now producing 1,950 metric tons of water. In the current configuration, we have 6 residential units, 12 greenhouses, 4 rec centers, 3 science workshops, 2 repair centers, and a med bay. In the 2080s, we finally hit our goal of 50 people on the surface and actually round out the decade with 51. Once again, we are stable at a stable technological setup point where we are expanding capabilities rather than adding to them. A notable event occurs for the first time in this decade. The first retirement of our initial Gen 1 hab units go from human-rated to non-vital storage. They will remain attached to the rest of the base so long as they are considered safe. However, they will not be used for humans because they have reached the end of their qualified lifetime. Entering the 2090s, you see the closure of our second open hex configuration. Our base is still accessible from all sides, but is now more safe than ever. By this point, we have stabilized the population at 51 people, but are still increasing the capabilities both in power and water production. ISRU hits its peak in this decade at 2,300 metric tons. We see the retirement of another 2 habs and our first 2 greenhouses as well. Coming into the home stretch of our buildup, we reach the year 2100. Our buildup actually ends in the year 2103 in this configuration. We have maximized our power to 1.35 megawatts. We have 7 HAB units retired, and our first 5 greenhouses have also retired. We have reached the end of this timeline. Now, we'll go back to the beginning and show you how this all gets there.
Thank you. So let's talk about launch vehicles. Our heavy lifter is the SLS, the Space Launch System. We actually do assume an upgrade to the SLS in its base configuration of the 1B to the 1B+. We're kind of splitting the difference here between the 1B and the 2B. The difference between those two stages would be 105 metric tons of LEO to 130. We found that we only really need the 115 capability in order to reduce cost of the overall architecture. Additionally, we supplement a lot of our launches of supplies and eventually even crew with heavy lift vehicles. Shown here, we have the Falcon Heavy, Vulcan Aces, and New Glenn. Later on, you'll see a lot of the Falcon Heavy, and that's just to symbolize a commercial vehicle. So any of these will work in our architecture. So one type of trajectory is the ballistic trajectory. It takes about 6 to 12 months to reach Mars using this type of trajectory, and it's where you burn at Earth, and then you just coast all the way to your destination. However, it's not the best way to get heavy payloads to your destination. One of the problems is you rely on chemical propulsion stages, which have a lower efficiency than compared to, say, low thrust trajectories, which can get more payload for the same launch vehicle. However, they take much longer, around 4 to 5 years total in our architecture, and that's because we also spiral out of Earth's orbit before we head to Mars. On the plot shown here, that's about a 2.5-year trajectory. Let's see, keep going. So additionally, we wanted to look at other ways to reduce the number of launches and reduce cost. And one way we found to do that was to use a cycler trajectory. And so for those of you who haven't heard of a cycler, it's a way of moving people from Earth to Mars and from Mars back to Earth without ever stopping. And so that saves on SLS launches in order to send up what you'll eventually see is these large chemical kick stages that have to push your vehicle out of the gravity well of Earth or Mars and then to its destination. So with our cycler, you start at Earth and you take about a year trip to Mars, where then when you get to Mars, you perform a flyby, and in red here is Mars's orbit, and you would come by over the top of Mars and use Mars gravity to send you down so that after you fly by Mars, you have the same period as Mars, but you're underneath the planet. And so half a period later, your trajectory will take you back on another flyby of Mars where you reverse what the initial flyby did so that it sends you back towards Earth. And then you perform a similar maneuver at Earth in order to fly by underneath Earth, and every 6 months you get another flyby. So in total, you end up with 4 flybys of Earth in order to resupply your vehicle, get crew back on board, and prepare for your next trip to Mars. However, this isn't a completely ballistic trajectory. So in order to accomplish this, we had to create a 600 kilowatt SEPTUG, which uses solar electric propulsion in order to modify the course of the trajectory to make sure that it always works out. So what happens when our payloads get to Mars? Well, we have to get them to the surface somehow. So we decided to use HIAD, which is the Hypersonic Inflatable Aerodynamic Decelerator. It's basically an inflatable balloon in front of your payload in order to increase your surface area so that the thin atmosphere of Mars can do more to slow you down before you reach the surface. So after HIAD slows you down, the nose cone pops off, and you actually light some engines on the front of your payload and perform hypersonic retropropulsion and eventually terminal descent and landing onto the surface of Mars. One of the big challenges here is that even our best estimates only gave us about a 50% payload mass fraction. So the payload here at entry when you're in orbit, if you're 80 metric tons here, your usable payload when you get to the surface is only 40 metric tons. So now I'm going to show you some bat charts. If you don't know what a bat chart is, it's a simplified way of showing kind of the concept of operations of a mission, where you will start on Earth, and in this case, we're starting with missions to the moon. So in 2018, we have our first exploration mission, or EM1. It's an uncrewed mission where we have our first launch of the SLS and also the Orion capsule. Oops, yeah, there. So the Orion crew vehicle can take a crew of 4, support them for about a month in orbit, and has a wet mass around 25 metric tons. And we will have our first crew launch using the Orion in 2021, and then our second one in 2023. In 2024, we start building our interplanetary vehicle with the launch of our first deep space habitat. This deep space habitat is based heavily on ISS technology. This module here is actually based on the Destiny module currently on the ISS. However, it also has this tunnel attachment that has power and thermal control systems to make it completely independent. A year later, we launch another crew mission with a co-manifested airlock node. So this airlock node allows more connections to your interplanetary vehicle so that you can perform resupply and maybe even more crew vehicle attachment points. A year later, we have another deep space hab nearly identical to the first that will connect. And that's also around when the crew mission ends. A year later, we have a second crew mission to continue that occupation of lunar vicinity. And a year and a half later, it ends as well. And by now, we have a fully assembled interplanetary vehicle, which looks like this, where it has a mass of about 100 metric tons, a pressurized volume of 260 meters cubed, and a habitable volume of 180 meters cubed. This will provide the necessary equipment and volume to get people from Earth to Mars and from Mars back to Earth. So we're now in 2027. We have a launch of our first SEP tug. And a SEP tug, or solar electric propulsion tug, uses the sun's energy in order to push heavier payloads that the SLS can't launch on its own to the destination. So for example, this injection capture stage, or ICS, weighs 60 metric tons, but it needs to be launched into a highly elliptical orbit that the SLS can't manage to do by itself. So they rendezvous in a lower elliptical orbit, the injection capture stage and the SEP tug, and then the SEP tug spirals out for about a year and a half in order to get to that final orbit. And so while it's doing that, we have a launch of a lunar departure stage on a heavy lift vehicle. This lunar departure stage is just a modified European service module with more propellant, and I'll show you what it does in a second here, where when the crew go to the interplanetary vehicle and they're getting ready for their mission, they need to leave lunar orbit. Well, you're stuck in the moon's gravity well. So this lunar departure stage, or LDS, pushes you out of lunar orbit into a highly elliptical orbit where you can now rendezvous with this ICS, which has spent the 2 years spiraling out. And once they rendezvous, you burn, and you're now on an interplanetary trajectory. In this case, it's just a really tiny interplanetary trajectory where you leave Earth's gravity well, but every 6 months, you end up flying by Earth again. And so you have an abort opportunity every 6 months to get your crew home. But nominally, this mission is 2 years long to simulate, or closer simulate, a full duration Mars mission. And then they land in 2031, and the interplanetary vehicle gets back into lunar orbit. So now Mars has been added to this picture because we're starting to head towards Mars. In order to do that, though, you need to pre-position some of your assets. So now we're using 2 of these ICS chemical kick stages, and it takes about 5 years for them to get to Mars. So they're launched first. Then you have another 2 sent to that highly elliptical Earth orbit. At the same time, you have this first ballistic launch of 2 of these construction rovers so that they can start preparing the land site and also allow the crew to perform some telerobotic operations when they get to the surface. One thing you'll notice here is we're not using the Orion anymore because we now have a second generation crew vehicle so that it can land on Earth or Mars. So now it can do double duty and we can get more bang for our buck. So this crew vehicle, while it takes crew to the IPV, but when they reach Mars, they don't go to the surface. There's not enough stuff there for them yet. So they just do an uncrewed entry test to make sure this vehicle is good to go. They perform telerobotics for about a 500-day stay and head back to Earth as the first crew to orbit the red planet. we're finally ready for our first surface mission, the first time people will step foot on the red planet. So now we're going to start pre-positioning some surface assets. The first thing we send, power and the Mars Ascent Vehicle. The reason we send those is that Mars Ascent Vehicle needs about 2 years in order to create enough oxygen to fully fuel itself so that by the time the crew leaves, they know they have a way to get home. Again, we start pre-positioning some of these chemical kick stages to get the interplanetary vehicle back, as well as we send 2 surface habitats where the crew will live. We also start sending pressurized rovers. These are just sent on ballistic quick trajectories because they're pretty light, and those will allow the crew to get around and explore the entire exploration zone. And we have a second rover in 2037, and we get to the crew launch. So this crew perform the same maneuvers that they've been performing in the last couple missions, leave the lunar orbit, get into a highly elliptical orbit, rendezvous with those kick stages, go to Mars. They have 500 days on Mars's surface in order to perform a ton of science and be like the new Apollo astronauts of the 2040s. However, we don't want just flags and footprints. We're going there to stay. So after this first surface mission, the second surface mission also uses the first interplanetary vehicle, but by the third mission, we have to decommission that vehicle and build the second generation interplanetary vehicle, as shown here. The main difference is we've expanded these modules to B330, the Bigelow inflatable modules, so that instead of taking 6 crew, we can take 12. Our technology has also increased to the point where that our life support system weighs essentially the same amount that it did when it was only taking 6 people. So during these missions, what does a typical steady state mission look like when you're building up the base? Well, as I mentioned on the previous slide, we're taking 12 astronauts, and we're doing that on average every other synodic period, which is about once every 4 years. In order to do that, we need 8 SLS launches and 20 heavy lift vehicles. Now, this may seem like a lot, but if you average that out to a per year basis, that's only 7 launches per year. Just last year, we launched 8 unmanned spacecraft to the ISS, and the year before we launched 10. So we're good at launching rockets. What these launches are taking these are the space assets. So these 4 chemical kick stages are launched by 4 SLS, and then the rest of these systems are launched by heavy lift vehicles, as well as the surface assets in order to sustain these additional members on Mars. And that's an SLS launch of our Gen 3 habitats, a launch of our Gen 2 habitat, a MAV, and more power, as well as additional heavy lift vehicle launches to take the smaller systems. Circled in red here are the 4 launches required for those chemical kick stages, as well as 2 of those SEP tugs. In the cycler pathway architecture that we investigated, this is the savings you get from switching to a cycler vehicle, is you can save these launches and these systems. So that's about that also translates into cost savings.
Now, throughout the year, several key areas for future study have become apparent. Among these are a better understanding of how to use Martian resources. Our base creates oxygen, water, and methane. Additional uses could include building materials to reduce dependence from Earth, thus decreasing launches. Our base uses an estimated 50 meters squared of growing area per person in the hydroponic setup. However, in our research, our analysis produced conflicting information suggesting as little as 10 meters squared may suffice. We rely heavily on fission reactors to supply the power needed for the base. SARES is the model that is currently used after 2050, but it is currently only conceptual. In the best case scenario, only 50% of the Mars entry mass is usable payload. Increasing this percentage reduces the number of required launches substantially. Missions to Mars provide unique challenges that no human has ever faced. For example, watching the Earth disappear completely behind you. Better understanding of how to maintain a healthy and happy crew for such long durations and under such conditions will be vital to mission success. We currently do not fully understand the long-term effects of reduced gravity and radiation exposure. For this architecture, it would not be uncommon to experience several decades in reduced gravity and a full year in microgravity before returning to Earth at an advanced age. This is not a complete list of future areas of study, of course. Sending humans to Mars, especially to establish permanence, requires a multidisciplinary approach for success. There are many challenges that must be faced along the way. Together, NASA, industry, and academia are paving the way to the Red Planet.
Why do we look to the stars?
You know, hundreds and thousands of years ago, looking up at the night sky. You know, on Earth, you can touch trees, you can touch water, you can try to understand those. You look at the stars, it's something that's just kind of beyond people.
As a reminder of two things, both how small we are by comparison and how much potential there is to explore.
It's just human nature to explore, and Mars is the next logical step.
Mars has been in our sights for thousands of years. The Romans named it after their god of war. How fitting for a planet that has proven to be so challenging. Over the years, we have fought to understand more and more about our red neighbor. With each generation comes new knowledge and new success. Mars is coming more and more into focus.
Touchdown confirmed. We're safe on Mars.
It's time to take another big leap.
By the mid-2030s, I believe we can send humans to orbit Mars and return them safely to Earth. And a landing on Mars will follow. And I expect to be around to see it.
It's because of the work of our NASA employees, contractors, and partners in classrooms, boardrooms, laboratories, and even garages across the country. That's why I say NASA is better today than it's ever been before.
This week, in the company of astronauts, I was honored to sign the NASA Transition Authorization Act right into law. With this legislation, we renew our national commitment to NASA's mission of exploration and discovery.
I'd like to visit Mars, yeah, for sure. I bet everyone wants to visit Mars. Staying on Mars will be tough.
These students are working hard to answer one very big question. How do you have 50 people live on Mars?
It takes all the skills, all the expertise, all the different perspectives to go take on this incredible challenge of taking this to Mars.
These students come from many different backgrounds and many different disciplines, bringing with them a wealth of knowledge. For the past several months, they have been working, living, breathing, and even dreaming about what it would be like to put people on the surface of the red planet. Let's see what they've come up with. A multitude of new and emerging technologies are incorporated into the design of the mission. The interplanetary vehicle ferries a new wave of explorers to Mars. Habitation modules provide a home for the trip. Crew vehicles take the crew to and from the IPV. Finally, chemical kick stages provide the energy to push the craft into deep space. The entry, descent, and landing of mission assets requires the utmost precision and control. An inflatable heat shield protects the payload from the fires and stresses of re-entry. While still supersonic, engines fire, bringing the cargo gently to the surface. In all, 40 metric tons of material can be landed. The Mars Ascent Vehicle provides transport into Mars orbit. The core protects the crew during the ascent. The fuel for the journey is produced from resources on the Martian surface. The MAV is the first step to getting back home after many, many years on the planet. As with any home, construction is necessary. Moving large assets is an important step. A scaled-up rover is capable of transporting full HAB modules from their landing site and integrating them into the structure of the base. Surface power is provided from a multitude of sources. Large solar arrays produce energy during the day, while nuclear sources provide a constant stream of energy for years at a time. Not everything can be brought from Earth. In-situ resource utilization is essential to living on Mars. Drills dig deep into the surface, heating and melting hidden ice, producing the first wells on another planet. On Earth, food is plentiful. On Mars, it's another story. Greenhouses provide the crew with most of their dietary needs. Also, they give a little bit of a green touch to a notoriously red planet. The habitation modules form a large portion of the on-surface assets. Each one houses spaces related to different goals of the mission, such as science, medicine, and recreation. As more HABs are landed, the base can start to grow. By 2048, the first Gen 2 habitation module has arrived. By 2060, 30 people are living on the surface of Mars. By the time 2080 comes around, 50 people have finally filled out the capacity of the base. At 2095, the base is sustaining 80% of food production. By 2103, mankind will have had a presence on Mars for over 60 years. Even with the best planning and the most intricate designs, many will still wonder, why go to Mars at all? What makes this effort worth it?
I think, if we don't explore beyond Earth and we stagnate, and potentially, it will be a threat to our human species.
Something epic, to look into the distance and say something like, this is our new beginning for all of us.
My key interest is trying to understand the past habitability, the chances that life might have existed and been preserved on the surface of Mars.
Challenge ourselves to push the bounds of what we can do technologically, and actually challenge what we do together as a species, because it is possible to go as one nation, but it's more likely that we'll go as one planet.
Well, any journey has to start somewhere. Going to the moon will be easier, but going to Mars will truly challenge us.
The challenge of Mars is one that we will never forget, no matter how long we live or how far we may go.
right. Thank you all so much for coming. And we'd like to open the floor now for questions. We'll have some microphones brought out to the audience. And thank you so much to all the people who made this possible. Cool. This is still live if you want to come up. This is live if you want to come out and talk. All right. Are there any questions from the audience? Okay.
Yes, my name is D.L. Still. It's been terrific. Don't you think possibly that we might be missing a boat on subterranean possible colonization on Mars, or perhaps already the terrain, some of the trenches in larger areas?
There are thought to be, and come up if one of you thinks I'm saying this incorrectly, but there are thought to be lava tubes existent on Mars, but they have not been found. And we wanted to keep the scope of our study bounded by what we thought was more reliable information. It's possible and probably a better option to dig beneath the surface, but we don't know what we're going to find when we start that.
To add on to that, we do know of some skylights that we've seen from collapsed lava tunnels. However, those exist in volcanic regions, which are far from the regions where you can extract water. Your two sources are either subsurface glacial ice, which aren't near those regions, or hydrated minerals, which we also haven't found any two locations like that overlap.
Any other questions? Okay, this one here.
Thanks. Great job, great presentation. There's a lot of landers here. You're delivering a lot of people, a lot of equipment to the surface.
Yep.
What do you do with expended lander stages? I see some that are under the habitats and kind of just get parked there, but how about all the other ones that land? What happens to them?
Currently, we do not remove the habitats from the landed stages. Here, Cody's.
That mic is live.
Hi, I'm Cody Foss. I worked on the radiation mitigation strategies. In terms of the human landers, we actually reuse those in terms of storm shelters. So in case of a solar particle event, which accompanies a solar flare, there's a lot of radiation released. And if we're caught in an ROI far away from our shielded base, we can actually get to those landers that we've repurposed as storm shelters for protection for a short amount of times.
Hello. How will these interplanetary kick stages be dealing with propellant boil-off?
So, yeah, that's a great point. Currently, they have their own cryogenic maintenance system. So we actually have a dry mass fraction of 20%, which is crazy high for a kick stage. However, you could see the solar rays and radiators coming off of those kick stages. Those are getting power to power the radiators so that we can reject the thermal energy absorbed from the sun, so we can maintain those cryogenic temperatures and have essentially zero boil-off, minus a little bit of leakage from the valves that you really can't eliminate.
As robotic systems increase in intensity, don't you see robotic systems being could increase our time frames on this?
Yes. The robotic systems are something that we didn't show. We are assuming that there will be a substantial amount of dependence on robotic assistance, especially for deployment of the habitat units before the humans arrive.
As well as a lot of telerobotics where even once they're on the surface, there's no reason for them to leave the HABs if they can just put on a VR headset and drive the rovers as if they were there as a simulation. Yeah, to reduce radiation and risk.
Also the risk of contamination to special regions. Go ahead.
Hey, Bryony Horgan, Planetary Science. Great presentation, guys. That was really cool. I wanted to ask, so I missed the first chunk of your presentation, so I apologize if you covered this, but I was, what about exploration? So how much radiation can one of your explorers take out in the rovers, and how much time can they spend in the rovers?
So I'll answer that a little bit while Cody walks up, but we actually set the limit at 150 millisieverts per year for the yearly annual dose that they are allowed to get. When they're inside the habitats, if they were in there 100% of the time, they'd get 90 millisieverts. So that leaves some leeway so that they can take these rover trips and still have some margin left in that radiation dose budget?
Yes, we derived the radiation doses with exploration EVA time in mind. We also assumed that there was going to be virtually no radiation shielding while performing EVAs. So the shielding on the habitats are such that we can still explore the planet without assuming a higher dose in radiation. As far as we need to. The thing is, if we spend a lot of time outside in our exploration zone, we can compensate for the radiation that we take there by spending more time within the colony. There's also, as I said before, these storm shelters throughout the exploration zone that if something were to happen, we can go to in order to cut down on our radiation dose.
And the main factor that would kind of limit how far we can go would be the rovers, as far as which way they can go. And it would be the MMSEV and the STV, and it would be between 100 and 200 kilometers away from the base.
Hi. What's the overall cost or annual budget for this?
We did a cost estimation throughout the life cycle, but it is extremely complicated, and giving you a single number doesn't really represent anything. So if you want to know about that, the reception afterward will have the cost guy with us, and we can answer questions like that. But it'll take a long time to explain it. Go ahead.
I'm a second grade teacher here in West Lafayette, Indiana.
Well, welcome.
Thank you. And I was just wondering, what kind of programs or outreach programs will you have to get the youth of today prepared to participate in this amazing adventure?
Did you want to come up? Yeah. Sure. If you would like to come up. We actually have been working with one of our faculty members in order to make sure this happens, but if you've got the microphone right there, so.
So we're working on putting together curriculum. We already have curriculum for elementary schools in place that I can get with you and give you some information about, but we'll also be putting together middle school and high school curriculum that will have students go through a very similar process to what they did as far as coming up with solutions, potential solutions for getting to Mars.
And if I might add to that, we actually have a VR presentation that actually right now an 8-year-old went through it, and she was having the time of her life. So that's another outreach.
We have an online question as well.
Do you have follow-up?
Yeah, I want to add to that.
Oh, okay.
Hi, everybody. My name is Trevor Jan. I worked on this project as well. My research outside of this project, I work with Professor Collicott, and we work on different zero-gravity flight experiments. And something that I'd like to inform you about is actually with some of the companies that are out there, you can now send a payload to space for about the same price that you pay for uniforms for your high school team. So actually, Professor Collicott, for example, worked with a local school recently, and they put together, with you? There you go, so you know. So they worked with the second graders and sent a payload to space. So.
All right, online question.
Yes, did the team conduct a formal risk identification and mitigation activity in your design process? And if so, did you address subsystem and component redundancy? And 2, after you conquer Mars, what is next? This was asked by Michael Baxter at Aerospace Corporation.
Do you want to pull up the backup slide for the risk analysis, or? Yeah, it's not here. All right. I will give you a very brief overview of this question. However, the person who actually did the risk analysis is not present with us today. So we will go over a very quick overview. These numbers represent the different probability of success for either mission or crew survival. Now this is an important differentiation if your crew dies versus if you simply can't do the mission. An example of the difference would be Apollo 13. The Apollo 13 did not lose anyone, so the crew mission success was the crew was successful, but the mission failed. They did not land on the moon. So as we go through these different sets of missions or types of missions, you can see the quantity decreases of success, but this is mostly because of our understanding of what it takes for these missions to be successful. This technology doesn't exist yet, especially for the later missions, and we've controlled it as much as possible with actually almost no redundancy planned so far. As these architectures start taking real form beyond just an initial scraping of the surface, we would start seeing redundancy, resiliency increase, which would increase all of these probabilities as well.
Yeah, and the scope of our project allowed us to do a system-level analysis of the risk. However, we didn't get into the subsystem level.
All right, and if you'd like to see a little bit more detail on, say, the lowest one of this, the Mars surface mission, what contributes primarily to that, you can see that the launch vehicle contributes to the loss of mission, while it's kind of a wash between the deep space habitats and the ICS for the loss of crew.
And the second part of that question was, after we conquer Mars, what's next?
There is no stopping, so.
One thing that's been brought up is just use Mars as a gas station. So you fill up at Mars before you go off and explore the rest of the solar system. So I guess that would be my answer. Any other questions from the audience?
Yep. Got a couple here.
How will Phobos and Deimos play into your exploration of Mars?
Do you want to take Phobos and Deimos?
So unfortunately, we didn't have the time to explore that too much. However, that Mars orbital mission does have the opportunity, if you're willing to add on a couple more launches, such as like another habitat, so that you can land that habitat on Phobos before you send the crew, as well as a couple kick stages pre-positioned at Mars to get the crew between what the orbit the interplanetary vehicle is in and Phobos orbit, so that during that Mars orbital mission, instead of only doing telerobotics, they could also go explore Phobos briefly.
Go ahead.
Yeah, a follow-up to a question that was asked earlier. You have people in this exploration zone, which is 100 kilometers in radius?
Yes.
Correct? 50 people, 60 years. Wouldn't they have explored every square inch of that area? And where do you... Isn't it time to go somewhere else?
We would hopefully explore every square inch, but probably not all considering, just because it's so incredibly difficult to transfer from one place to the next on Mars' surface. But the regions of interest that are shown here are not simply dots, they're areas, and they have significant interest, scientific value to them. So we're thinking that they may have been able to reach every place, but the likelihood of exploring, especially down and excavating down to see the Martian history, is unlikely. Mainly because this area is glaciated, and it's supposed to have sediment in layers after layer, showing all the way the history all the way back to when Mars was theoretically much more habitable.
And to add on to that, with our current setup with ISS, it has a rich history of doing a lot of science. It's still doing a lot of science. And so it's in essentially one place for the last 20 and eventually 30 years, and they're going to be doing science the entire time. So I don't think we're going to run out of science. And a second point was when you compare this to the South Pole Station, where 9 out of 10 of the people who are in the South Pole Station are there just to keep the base operational. We don't have 50 scientists on Mars. We have 5 scientists and 45 people scrambling to keep all the systems working and keep everything operational.
And another thing is the ability to expand. Deuteronomus Mensae is right next to another exploration zone that potentially they could start expanding the base out, but that is beyond the scope of what we looked into. Any other questions? Oh, go ahead.
I just want to comment. I want to tell you how much I appreciate seeing all your hard work and having this kind of energy and product and getting people together. I think the end product of this is really the excitement and the experience that comes out of it that I'm sure all your participants will remember throughout their lives, and I want to compliment you. I want to also mention I'm founder of the Sasakawa International Center for Space Architecture at the University of Houston, and we've been doing this kind of stuff for about 40 years too. And so I think the good thing is when we also look at things from a comprehensive perspective, both orbital and surface, and the elements and the issues and so on. I compliment you commend you on the fact you're looking at a comprehensive approach, and I think when when you establish different parameters and different assumptions about a project, it drives it in different directions. And by collaborating and working together, both with the centers and the universities, I think we can do a lot of trade-offs and a lot of trade studies and comparisons and what-ifs kind of issues. And I just want to tell you that we're very eager to work with you and others. And I think, again, the big product is not only preparing people for the future, but creating the kind of channels between the universities and between the other organizations so that we can kind of get beyond the piecemeal approaches that look at pieces of things and look at the connect the dots issues that deal with even the political and economic and on all the other issues, the radiation. And we could have 100 conversations out of what you presented today, and I hope we do have. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You threw a lot of information at us very quickly.
Yes.
I'd like to sort of look at it, on a little bit more leisurely. When is this going to be on YouTube? When are you going to publish your report for the course?
Well, I was hiding there. Yeah, so this is recorded, so we'll put up on YouTube very soon. You'll get an email very soon as well. And then, of course, we have an upcoming talk by Mr. Gerstenmaier, so that will be on YouTube as well with the required permission from NASA. And the report should be out, I cannot tell exactly, but in the next 2 weeks, the report should be out. That's currently under review before it is publicized out. So absolutely, all the reports, everything will be out into the public.
Go ahead.
Yes, so for about 4 years, I've been looking at a similar problem, trying to figure out how we make the place safe before the first crew goes. And I really like the work you've done here. And as we spoke this morning, there are a few things you could look at to help buy that safety before the first crew ever leaves. And I hope you, well, maybe you guys won't do it, but maybe next year the students will incorporate into the future work. But they're, tapping into autonomy is one way to do that. Make sure that your systems are operating and you understand the failure modes long before the first crew leaves Earth. There's also a crew abort for when they enter the atmosphere, they can abort to orbit or abort to surface and then hop back to the station. I told you about a concept of working at NASA for that. So again, just try to buy the safety up front before the first crew goes. That'll answer Michael's question from aerospace.
That's an excellent point.
Great job.
Thank you.
Cody? Steve? Did you have a question? Oh, okay, never mind. Anyone else have a question? Go ahead.
Hi guys, great job. Question about maintenance and logistics. So it wasn't clear, at least to me, when you resupply your base, do your spare parts come with the crew or are there dedicated flights? Second part to that question is how did you estimate your spare parts demands?
So, Trevor, do you want to come up and address this? Is Shroth here?
Shroth, yeah.
Do you want to come up and
Can you repeat your question real quick?
Mike.
Question was, Question was, are your resupply flights, are they separate or do you bring cargo and spare parts with each crew landing? Second part of that question was how did you estimate your spare parts demands? And I guess that feeds into what is your maintenance strategy? Are you doing repair and replace at the ORU level? Are you doing board level replacement? Were those considered?
Okay, so to your first part of the question, we have primary launches that send primary systems. So let's take an example like your power systems or your ISRU or your HABs. What we did was we looked and we said, okay, so how much cargo mass can we send during those launches? Great. Now how much do we have left over after we send the primary systems that we care about? And then we took that remaining mass, and we said, okay, so what can we do with that? And there's those launches in particular that I'm talking about, those take roughly 5 years to get there. So we look at what kind of mass can we fill up that spare capacity with mass that is non-perishable. So, well, what do we do with the mass that is perishable? Well, we do have separate launches for that type of mass, and those are going on type of launches that can either take 5 metric tons all the way up to 10 metric tons. But the idea is that you're taking your spare capacity and you fill it up as much as you can. And then when you can't, you push that to your other launches. Those are ballistic launches. So you're looking at 5 years versus 6 months. So all your perishable goods go on the 6-month launches and vice versa. But in terms of estimating, and correct me if I'm wrong, but you wanted to know how we estimated spare parts. So we made an assumption initially that there was 10% mass that we wanted to account for planned spare parts. And I did a lot of work on this for probably about half the semester on how do you predict when something's going to fail. And if you look at that on Earth, for example, what they tend to do is they tend to take a lot of mass data. So let's say construction equipment. You want to understand the time periods of when it's going to fail most at the beginning of its lifespan and when it's going to fail most at the end. Well, there's a point where you can't make a lot of direct comparisons between equipment on Earth and equipment on Mars. So the problem quickly becomes something that's at this point near impossible, so we have to run with assumptions. So the assumptions that we made was 10%. And we have sources that back that up as to why we went with that. But unplanned spare parts, that's something that would have to either go on a ballistic flight, because that's a 6-month trip. Yeah, because five years is a little much.
All right. Probably have.
Was the trend where you add more hardware on the surface requiring more spare parts, did that, and hence more logistics flights, did that become apparent? And were there any thoughts about in-situ manufacturing, for example, as a way of closing that growth in spare parts demand?
We did look at that. We did look at 3D printing certain things, but there's an extent to what you can make on the surface, and but to answer the rest of your question, the more stuff you send, yes, you need more spare parts, and we do see the trend increasing as population goes up. But an interesting trend also emerges when you start thinking about, okay, so what if we engineer commonality into a lot of our equipment? Well, you start looking at an effect of where the more equipment that you have on the surface, the more equipment that you have eventually retire on the surface, because things are engineered to only last so long. Well, you do need to send spares, but eventually you're going to have a situation where, let's say, you send the planned spares, but you also have so much required or retired equipment that you also have the potential for cannibalization of those parts. So over time, mission reliability would actually increase, because all of a sudden you have more to work with on the surface.
All right, and we have time for one last question. Go right ahead.
Back to the 3D printing. Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm. Good job.
It seems like, as I mentioned before, there's so many areas of potential collaboration between different organizations, and the emerging area of 3D printing is interesting. I don't see it as a panacea, but initially we think about printing individual pieces and parts that break down. Mm-hmm. Then we think about developing systems that break down, where now we have to divide the systems so we can get the pieces in them. So from the very beginning, we're planning systems that have reparable parts. They're not all welded shut and so on.
Yeah.
And then when we take that, and then at some point we say, well, can we grind up stuff and reuse the material, and can we ultimately use ISRU, and can we build structures and so on? I think, again, this is an area where there's so much work to be done in a practical sense of how can we really do this to reduce the amount of pieces we have to bring. How can we really look at the effects of this? Can we do this IVA? Can we actually do 3D printing? What about microgravity? What about partial gravity? What about dust? What about all these other issues? So I think that's one. Another area that I suggest is an area of collaboration on food growth, in terms of how much can we really produce. Not only how fast can we grow it, but what's the nutrition value, and how do you incorporate all the support systems in those inflatable modules, because there's a whole lot of water and utility stuff and life support, and plants don't necessarily like the same environments that people do, and So all these issues, I would just, again, emphasize, spread across this country and the world, we have so many different people working on different areas that we can be cross-pollinating each other, if you use excuse the metaphor, but I think there are these opportunities to work together.
Absolutely.